Our speaker today is Joseph Vandello, and he is going to be talking about the masculine dilemma of seeking work flexibility. Professor Vandello is a professor, obviously, but also the area director at the Cognition, Neuroscience, and Social Program at the University of South Florida. Professor Vandello researches how people see manhood as distinct from womanhood and the consequences of this thinking for understanding men's aggression, risk-taking, health, relationships, and attitudes toward work and family. In his work on gender, Joe explores how gender norms present barriers for men in balancing the boundary between work and family life. In 2014, with his colleague Jennifer Bosson, Joe won the Researcher of the Year Award from the American Psychological Association, Division 51, Society for the Psychology of Men and Masculinities. And in 2015, he won the University of Florida's Jerome Kravanik Distinguished Teacher Award for undergraduate teaching. So he is a force to be reckoned with in the classroom, as well as from a scholarly perspective. I'm so excited that we have really, truly one of the leading minds in psychology helping us to think about gender as not only belonging to women, but in a much more broadly inclusive way. And so please let me not take any more time, and please join me in welcoming Joe. One other thing I should have said, I'm so sorry, I'm going to jump in front of you. Joe is open to questions. So as we go through, I'll watch the chat if you've got questions as you go along, and then we'll save time at the end as well for conversation. So again, thank you, Joe. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. That was embarrassingly flattering, but I'm really happy to be here and honored. And I'm especially appreciative of the people that are in the European time zones, because it's got to be very late for them. So we, Dr. Riley Bowles and I were talking earlier today about these topics, and she asked me to speak on a paper I'd written about a decade ago. So one of the things that it kind of forced me to do was to kind of look at the literature since I've written that paper, and so that's been helpful. And I welcome other people's comments about probably areas that I've missed in the meantime, and especially considering what's happened in the world with the pandemic the last couple of years, and how that may have upended all the things with this seismic shift in work and family. So at the end of the talk, I'm going to get a little bit more speculative about where things are going, with presenting some new data, but also kind of speculating on some things as well. As you said, I'm happy to welcome questions throughout if people get my attention while I'm talking as well. So I'm going to try to share my screen here. So I'm going to be talking today about gendered aspects of flexible work. And just so you know, I'm going to define that as any alterations to either the time or the place where people get work done on a regular basis. So that encompasses a number of different kinds of things. And specifically, I'm going to talk about how norms about manhood and masculinity stigmatize flexible work. So that's kind of the overall topic here. But let me share my screen. And does that look how it's supposed to look?
That looks great, Joe. Thank you.
Okay, good. Okay. So for most of my career, I've been interested in how people think about manhood and masculinity, and how that influences men's behavior and women's behavior, and their choices and their attitudes. And I'm going to start by talking about another thing that Hannah mentioned to me, is that I could maybe tell a little bit about my personal story about how I got into this research. So I want to start by talking about a long-standing collaboration I have with Dr. Jennifer Bosson. When we hired Jennifer in, I think it was 2005, I was doing some research at the time, early in my career, on men's honor around the world in a cultural sense, and its relation to things like aggression. Jennifer was doing some stuff on identity threat and role rigidity, and we had these conversations early on, right when she was hired, and we started to develop this this theory together that we call precarious manhood theory. We published our first paper in 2008 on that, and that began a long series of collaborations. And so, because that theory of precarious manhood has been kind of the guiding framework for much of my research, I want to start by just kind of briefly summarizing that, and then because that's kind of the lens through which I've framed a lot of the research that I'll be talking about. So when men talk about manhood, they speak about it almost like there's some kind of manual out there for the rules about what it takes to be a man. Like there's almost like a book out there. And in fact, there are books. There's all kinds of books out there. Go to any bookstore and you'll find all sorts of books about how to make a man. And this seems to be exclusively a man thing. You don't find nearly the same types of books about women on the shelves. So this idea was kind of the starting point for our research. That is, how do people see manhood? How do they think about manhood? And so we did a series of early studies where we tested, and that was the basis of this 2008 paper, where we tested and we found that people think about and they talk about manhood differently than they talk about womanhood. In short, it's something that a man has to do to become a man. You make manhood happen in a way that people don't really talk about womanhood that way. In fact, what we would argue is there may be 4 hallmarks of manhood. First of all, manhood is achieved, whereas womanhood is ascribed. Manhood is an elusive status. It's not a developmental certainty. That is, people don't automatically become men as they grow into adulthood. It is tenuous. That is, it is impermanent. It can be taken away or lost, even if you do acquire the status of manhood. And it's confirmed by other people. That is, it requires some type of public demonstration of proof. It's not enough for you to say, I'm a man. It requires other people to acknowledge that. Turns out that belief is pretty ubiquitous, and we've recently been documenting it in other countries around the world as well, to greater or lesser extent. So that belief, or that set of beliefs, has a lot of important implications. But one implication is that men often feel anxious about their status, especially given that in the United States and in most Western cultures, there aren't really any formal rites of passage into adulthood where you can say, now I'm a man. And so because of that, men, more than women, are sensitive to threats to their manhood status. And that motivates them to take compensatory actions to defend their manhood, or to avoid feminine behaviors would be another way. And so our research has shown that this has all sorts of implications for men, for things like aggression, for their capacity for risk-taking, for their health, for their relationships, for their sex lives. And importantly for this talk, I'm going to talk about how that impacts work and family. So what are the implications of precarious manhood for work and family? Well, work, and in particular the breadwinner role, has long been a central part of masculinity. And that expectation is really still strong today, despite the fact that, since the mid-20th century, women's roles in the workforce have changed greatly over that time. As recently as 2017, this is a Pew study from 2017, 71% of Americans believe that being able to support a family was synonymous with being a good husband and a good father, not so much for women, for being a good wife or partner. People like Mary Blair Loy in San Diego and Joan Williams at the University of California have written about what they call the norm of work devotion and the ideal worker schema that's prevalent in the United States, which is particularly strong among men. So, I think this makes work a moral concern for men. In other words, a good man is defined by his work and his commitment to work. So it is something I think is really deeply embedded into men's sense of identity and their sense of self. And these norms are also intertwined with precarious manhood, because extreme work schedules and constant work availability are a way to enact masculinity. And in its more toxic form, some workplaces are characterized by what my colleague Jen Berdal has called the masculinity contest cultures, where men use the workplace as a place to defend their manhood in kind of extreme competitive ways. I should also note that some scholars have argued that there are newer masculine norms that have started to emerge in the 21st century, like the involved father norm, which complicates things further, because now you have this norm of work devotion, which still exists and is still strong, meaning that men are now facing increasing pressures to both devote themselves to work fully and be there emotionally and physically for their kids as well. One piece of evidence for the centrality of work to manhood is what happens when men lose work. We did a study a few years ago, this was about a decade ago, where This was shortly after the Great Recession from a decade ago, where we looked at the effects of unemployment on men and women. And we found that unemployed men, and particularly breadwinners, that in other words, in this case, married men with children, thought that they were seen as less manly by others, and they had more symptoms as a result of that of poor mental health, things like anxiety and depression. And this wasn't true for unemployed women. And then there's other work. This is work outside of my lab. This is work by other people. Pearson and Dahl and colleagues found that that men's sense of manhood is really wrapped up when men's breadwinner status is challenged or threatened. In this case, in their study, they were looking at what happens when men are out-earned by their partners, their female partners. They experienced sleep and sex problems like erectile dysfunction. So anyway, the bottom line is that work is really important in shaping men's sense of manhood, their identity, their moral choices. So I want to turn now to how this can help us understand men's and women's attitudes about work flexibility and their participation in work flexibility. So as I was thinking about this, I guess it's over 10 years ago now, I got invited to a small group meeting headed by Joan Williams, a law school professor at the University of California at Hastings. And we were, the small group was organized around the idea of workplace flexibility and the flexibility stigma. And I want to put this in the context of how the workplace has changed over the last few years and how those expectations have changed. As more women have entered the workplace over not just the last few years, but over the last few several decades, these shifts have brought with them changes in expectation where work and family start to intersect. For instance, even though we're still not equal, men and women's contributions to domestic work and to childcare have started to become more balanced over the past decades. And as a result of this, or in kind of concert with that, people are starting to desire work and work-life balance. And this shows up in survey after survey. This is true of men, this is true of women. People in surveys will say, yes, work-life balance is very important to me. Companies have also started to recognize this and become more responsive to this as well. By 2005, for instance, more than 2/3 of private American companies have started offering flexible work schedules. Approximately half offered part-time work and job shares. Approximately 1/3 offered compressed work weeks, telecommuting opportunities. And those numbers are even higher now. I was having trouble finding firm numbers about what it looks like today, but I found a couple of studies. One study from last year found that as many as 80% of companies offer some type of work flex opportunities, although those are not always formalized. Maybe about a half of those have it formally in writing somewhere. And then I found another study that showed about 2/3 of small businesses now offer some mode of flexible work arrangements. But offering work flexibility is not the same as taking it. And even though work flexibility programs are widespread now in the United States, their usage is not. Oh, I also want to, as an aside, another thing that Hannah had asked me to do as part of this talk was to consider intersectional issues. And I have to kind of admit that I maybe failed a little bit on this count in that it's been a blind spot in my own research, but it's also, it's difficult to find intersectional research in this. So I certainly welcome anybody that has thoughts on this as I go. But a lot of the things I've been saying and a lot of the figures I've been saying are probably truer of more of the professional class than they are of the working class. I mean, it's not a surprise to anyone that people in working class and lower class jobs have less flexibility options. So the question I want to ask at this point is, why is there this reluctance to take advantage of flexible work opportunities? There's a number of reasons for that. Part of it is probably some organizations, no doubt, probably have a tacit message that if you use these programs, you use them at your peril. But I don't think that's true of all organizations. I know that other organizations have really made sustained efforts to endorse those and support workplace flexibility programs. I think part of the answer is at least deeply embedded in gendered expectations. So as I said, when I was invited to this small group meeting about 10 years ago, I was aware of some research out there that talked about the program showing people who violate gender roles suffer penalties in the workplace. So for instance, Lori Rudman has done some really interesting research on the backlash against agentic women, showing that women who present themselves as ambitious and self-confident, they're viewed as competent, but they're not viewed as liked, and sometimes they are not hired, and they suffer workplace penalties because of that. My colleague Jen Berdal has done some interesting research on gender harassment. She finds that the targets of gender harassment are often agentic women, are often masculine women, what she calls uppity women. And then Amy Cuddy and Peter Glick and Susan Fisk have done research on what they call the motherhood penalty, showing that working moms, but not working dads, are viewed as competent but cold and get penalized in hiring and promotion. Most of all this research is those look at women and has focused on women, and very little research at that time focused on men. So one of the goals of my research at that time was to look at the penalties that men might face for work flexibility. And so this is what we call the flexibility stigma. So the flexibility stigma is the stigma that people face who seek flexible work arrangements. And as I mentioned before, that might be seen as violating this norm of work devotion that's common in our culture, and that's particularly common or apparent to men. So there was reason going in this to believe that the penalty might be greater for men. Mary Blair Loy, I mentioned, talked about the work devotion schema that exists for men. She also talks about a family devotion schema that exists for women, which would suggest that the penalty would be greater for men. Lori Rudman talked about the status incongruity hypothesis, which predicts that men get penalized not so much for communality, for acting in communal ways, but really for status violations, for violating norms of being agentic and status striving. And so work flexibility would go against that. So we had reason to suspect and hypothesize that men in particular would face flexibility stigma. So we published a paper in 2013 on this male work flex stigma. So I want to walk you through what exactly we found there. So we were really looking at two questions here. First of all, we were interested in whether men valued work flexibility and valued work-life balance to the extent that women did. And then secondly, do they actually pursue that regardless of whether they value it? And then as a second question, and so this was two studies, that was the first study. And the second study, we were interested in the question of how people actually evaluate men who seek flexible work arrangements. So let me walk you through the papers or the studies. In the first study, we surveyed the career aspirations and expectations of college students who were just about ready to graduate. So as they were kind of nearing seeking out careers, we asked them, first of all, what they wanted in a job. So we presented them with a series of, I think it was 10 aspects of jobs, and we asked them to rank them in terms of the characteristics that they found most important. And we looked at what men valued and what women valued. And this is what the list looked like. And the first thing you'll notice is that the lists are pretty much the same. This is the ranks of men and the ranks of women. And there's almost no difference between them. Men and women are looking for the same thing. And you'll also notice that both men and women value work-life balance and work flexibility quite highly. In fact, the only thing that they ranked higher was compensation. Not surprisingly, these are college students, they want to get paid, but after getting paid, they want work-life balance and work flexibility. So that's one thing we found, that there was no gender difference in terms of valuing work flexibility and work-life balance. And by the way, that still holds true today, 10 years later. This was a survey from earlier this year. In this survey, they were looking at people who were on the job market looking to change jobs. And again, they found that flexible work arrangements were one of the most valued things that people were looking for, seeking out new jobs. So if anything, it still holds today. But that's what they valued. The other thing we asked them, though, is what do you actually think you're going to do when you seek a job? What do you anticipate prioritizing? And this is where we start to find gender differences. Men and women were not equally likely to anticipate seeking and prioritizing work flexibility. In fact, men were less likely to report intentions to seek work. And that's about a medium-size effect. So then we asked, well, what exactly predicts what people intend to seek out? And what we found was that it differed for men and women. For men, and this helps explain why perhaps we get this disconnect between what men value and what they intend to seek out. For men, their intentions to seek workplace flexibility was predicted by what they thought other people would think of them. In other words, to the extent that men thought that they would be seen by other people as less masculine, those men were the least likely to seek out workplace flexibility. For women, it was the opposite. For women, to the extent that they thought they would be perceived as more feminine for seeking workplace flexibility, they were the most likely to seek workplace flexibility. So what we're seeing then is that there's this perception that among men that they would be stigmatized in terms not just of their ideal workers, but as in terms of their masculinity, and that might be an impediment to them, even though they desired workplace flexibility.
Could I jump in for 1 second, Joe? I'm sorry.
Sure.
There's just a question of clarification, and then I'm going to get there's also another substantive question which I'm going to hold. But Liz Hovland's asking: is there a specific definition of workplace flexibility that you used in this study?
Yes. So I'm trying to remember what it was. I think it was based on the rankings that we asked them. So it was a pretty general. It wasn't. We didn't ask them, for instance, to prior, or we didn't ask them whether they intended to seek. I think we gave them a list. We defined workplace flexibility broadly by saying workplace flexibility could be anything from flexibility in terms of time or place, like flex, remote work, hybrid work, compressed work weeks. So I think we gave them a list of examples of what that could entail. Does that answer the question? Yeah, okay. Anybody have any other questions or comments at this point?
Well, there was one other question. Do you want to finish explaining the study? And then there's another question that kind of speaks to the a little bit of like sort of the level of the status of the worker, but I'm thinking maybe I'll save that question. Is that helpful to?
Yeah. I'll walk you through the second study and then
okay, good. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm going to start talking about social class a bit more as well, if that might be an opportunity to.
Yeah, I mean, there's one more question here that just came up about, that time and place are fairly different in terms of they are, and so that could be a follow-up study in itself to look at.
Yeah, and so the short answer is we didn't distinguish between those things, and so I couldn't say whether we might find differences if we asked more specifically about that.
Great.
Yeah, and clearly right now, I think, especially post-pandemic, I think when people think about work flexibility, they're thinking hybrid work and working from home more than other types of flexibility. But I think it's important to acknowledge that work flexibility can mean many things. It can mean taking time off after the birth of a kid. It could be compressed work week. It could be flex time. It could mean that it comes in different flavors, I guess is the larger point. Okay, so going back to the paper here, so we have some evidence to suggest that that people have this perception that they will be stigmatized, particularly men, stigmatized in terms of their masculinity. In the follow-up study, in study 2, we wanted to see if that was really true. That is, are men actually stigmatized as being less masculine? So we did a study in which we had people evaluate a hypothetical flexibility seeker. And our hypotheses were that we predicted that people would evaluate someone who sought a flexible work arrangement. They would give them lower job evaluations than one who works traditional hours, lower pay and so forth. But in addition to these direct penalties, we also predicted that there would be indirect penalties in the forms of trait or character judgments as well. And that those penalties would be greater for male targets. So we had people evaluate this is a hypothetical scenario in which a worker goes to their boss and seeks a flexible work arrangement. In this case, it was about a part-time work after the birth of a child. So the person said, I want to cut back on my hours for a bit. And we manipulated whether that worker was male or female. What did we find? We found that everybody, regardless, in terms of job evaluations first, we found that everybody penalized the flexible worker. They were less likely to promote this person and recommended lower pay. And there was no effect for target gender here. That is, everybody who sought that, male and female, was given lower job evaluations. Then we looked at trait evaluations as well, and we found here that people rated a person seeking a flexible work arrangement as lower on male prescriptions. That is, things like lower on competitiveness and leadership ability and high self-esteem, and higher, that is, the flex seeker was rated higher on female prescriptions, things like sensitive, humble, emotional. And so what we're finding, in short, across the studies, were that flex seekers are penalized on specifically masculine traits associated with high status. So seeking flexibility is riskier for men. It's not just job evaluations, and it's not just raises, it's character evaluations as well. By the way, this is consistent with another study that my colleague Lori Redmond did and published in the same issue of that journal of social issues, where she found that men who requested a family leave to care for I think it was a sick child or a mother in one version, they suffered a femininity stigma. So compared to the control targets, a male leave requester was viewed as weaker and penalized on male particular traits, so less agentic. So it's really this double penalty for men. It's not only a flexibility stigma, but it's a femininity stigma as well. So I wanted to say a little bit about social class as well, since that was one of the things that I was asked to speak on.
Actually, before you do that, before we switch to that, could I bring in a couple of other things? Now, this might be an all right moment. Is that okay? Because there's some interesting questions that are popping up about.
Sure.
So one question that I think is just maybe worth just clarification, and that is, how should we understand what you're characterizing here as traits as opposed to stereotypes?
So these are prescriptive traits. And so when we talk about gender stereotypes have a descriptive and a prescriptive component. And we were specifically interested in prescriptive stereotypes here, the shoulds and the should nots and the proscriptions as well. And so I would argue that these are not stereotypes. These are, in the case of what we were asking, these are prescriptions. We asked people, how do you see this person? How do you see this person who sought flexible work arrangements? Do you see this person as sensitive? Do you see this person as having good leadership ability? So we were specifically asking them to apply these traits to that person in a prescriptive sense.
So another question I'd love to bring in is Jared, and maybe Jared, I'll just have you ask your own question, but it seems relevant to this idea of like the conditions under which people are more likely to make attributional stereotype-based attributions. But hop in, Jared, please.
Thanks. Joe, thanks so much. I find this research really interesting. It's making me think of, so my colleague Lottie Balin, who actually I think is in this Zoom right now, wrote a terrific book called Breaking the Mold. And there's some really thought-provoking examples in there about how we see people who don't work as many hours, but actually are more productive than someone who did work as many hours. Somebody sticking in the office all the time versus somebody else is getting the same performance as the person who's sticking in the office all the time, but able to do it faster. So like they're not working really late hours. And instead of your example on this slide actually kind of reminds me of this, because the participants in the study were only seeing, I take it, whether the person was seeking these flexible arrangements or not, but was unable to see the performance of the individuals. And I just wonder what you think would happen if you were comparing someone who was higher or the same performance level, but used flexibility provisions versus someone who is not using those provisions. Because in Lottie's work, you know, she suggests we should actually prefer the one who's taking less time and being just as productive, because that sort of suggests that that person has much more potential. They can do more with less. And therefore, if I ever needed them for something, like I would want to hire that person because they have the ability to get things done faster and better.
I think that's a great question. And if you would have asked me this question 10 years ago when I did this research, I would have probably said that you'd get great pushback from organizations, because I think there was this stigma against that argument saying that face time matters. I think that norm is starting to erode due to the pandemic. And maybe Lottie might be able to speak to data on this that I don't know about, but my sense, and this is really just a sense that, like I said, I don't have data to back this up, is that one of the things you're starting to see from workers to make the case for hybrid work and so forth is that it's more efficient for me. I get more done. I'm not on the road. I'm not commuting. So I do think that norm might be changing. So that's the optimist in me that says that maybe organizations are starting to say, yeah, maybe there is more efficiency with these models. It's not necessarily a zero-sum game. It's not a win-lose, but maybe we can all stand to gain from this. Not just the workers who might gain with work-life balance at the cost of organizational productivity, but maybe everyone benefits from this. Whether there's strong data on that, I don't know.
Thanks.
So because we get to enter now a little bit the land of speculation, can I throw out, I'd like to pull in a couple of other people who have questions related to, what would happen as you change aspects of the backdrop, that is the organizational context or the level of the worker. So maybe what I think we'll do is, Laura, if you would unmute Ben first, and then Shamim, and then we can get both of their questions, and then let Joe continue on with his talk, which I think was planning on addressing some of these, but maybe he can elaborate a little more with these questions. So Ben, you had a question a little earlier in the chat about executive status.
Yeah, no, and again, enjoying the talk so far. I mean, I guess a question that I had, and this just gets to some of the, the data I've done, collected in my work around executive influence. And I guess the question I had is that, like, I would hypothesize that if CEOs or their top executives, especially visibly, take, whether it's parental leave, whether it's, work remotely, presumably that would influence some of these norms. Again, I don't know if you've looked at that. I've seen certain things with regards to like workday length in looking at things like email data or meeting data, for example, that would say that when executives do it, it is more likely to transmit to frontline folks. But I don't know if you've looked at that.
So you anticipated a slide that I have coming up, but it's completely speculative. It's not. I don't have the data, but I was going to suggest, and I am going to suggest at the end, that these kind of symbolic gestures are really important from at the top, these top level, top down. So yes, I agree with you, but I don't have the data to back it up.
I'm going to take the liberty of popping in the chat, actually a chapter from a book in which that reviews some of the related literature. So from different disciplinary perspectives, not from psychology. And actually, if it's okay for me to highlight some of that, Joe, going back for, but one of the things that literature has actually shown is that in some respects, like more privileged workers have greater potential, greater access to these types of things. Yes. But sometimes they feel that much more extreme pressure actually for workplace devotion. And so there's a little bit of an kind of dilemma there embedded in these, particularly in these very top executive level jobs.
Yeah, this actually speaks to the class issue I was going to mention here. In the next
why don't I let you do the class issue, and then we'll go back to Shamim, who I think actually had a little bit of a connection issue, and then I'll come back.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to take questions or comments at any point. So, I haven't said much about social class yet, but I do think it's critical to understanding work flex stigma. So for instance, how do we make sense of the finding that, as I just showed, that men are stigmatized more for work flex, but at the same time, there's also data showing that men have more work flex opportunities than women. And I think to understand that, you have to understand class analysis. It stems from the fact that there are far more men than women who occupy these high status jobs. And as you said, workers in high status jobs typically are given more control over their work hours and so forth. So just as an example, this is a survey from just this year showing that flexibility, in this case, it's really about working remotely or hybrid. You see more of that with higher wage jobs. I have another one here that just shows a breakdown of remote work availability by different occupations. And if there's a pattern here, I think it's that at the top here, you have more kind of male-oriented jobs, computer, math, business, architecture, so forth. which tend to have more flexible work options in terms of remote hybrid compared to things like food preparation, healthcare, things where you tend to see women clustered in them more. So here's the irony, I think, is that work flex is less available to low-wage workers, but they have the most need for it oftentimes because they're constrained in other ways. For example, by lack of affordable childcare options, or partners that have non-overlapping work schedules, or less flexibility themselves. So to kind of go back to a point that you just mentioned, Hannah, when we break this down by a class analysis, where for the professional classes, you said, and particularly men, there's often this expectation to devote full time to work, unencumbered by family responsibilities. And so the problem that professional class workers often face is too much work, that there's this expectation that you will be completely devoted, have all kinds of free time. For working class, lower class workers, they often face the problem of not enough work hours. So the complaint that you often get among the working class is that they just don't have enough work. And because of that, studies show that when low income workers ask for workplace flexibility, or when they even have any kind of restrictions placed on whatsoever on their availability to work, they often are likely to give fewer hours, which can be a problem. So I guess the point I'm making is that the flexibility stigma cuts across social class, but what triggers it can be different. So for professional or managerial jobs, the flexibility stigma is triggered by career interruptions or putting limits on the hours that you work. Whereas for low-wage workers, the flexibility stigma can be triggered by things like tardiness or absenteeism. And both of those are rampant in among working class men because of the rigidity built into those types of jobs that are typical of those types of jobs. So I don't know if that, maybe it speaks a little bit to the issue you're asking. So at this point, I was going to actually kind of start to look ahead to the future of flex jobs. I can take questions at this point, but I can also peer into my crystal ball a bit.
Maybe I could bring in one more question that
Sure.
kind of builds on this. Shamim, I saw it had to come out and come back. Shamim, are you here? Shamim had a question about, maybe you could raise your hand so I know your little yellow virtual hand so that I know you're here. Or Laura, are you able to?
Shameen is unmuted.
He is unmuted. Okay, great. Shamim, I'm going to ask you to ask your question, but I might frame it. Actually, you go ahead, Shamim. You just dive in. She's got a question about organizational types.
Yeah, my question is about the organizations and companies as compared to the government organization, government companies. So in many countries, they have different hours and policies for the women. If she's on a higher position, she gets more flexible time in her workplace. But when she works in a lower position, she doesn't have those flexible work policies for her. So what is the policy in the US?
Well,
So
the policies in the US are about as bad as you can get compared to virtually every other country in the world. For instance, we are one of, I think, 3 countries in the world that does not have a paid paternal leave at the government level, paid paternal leave. I think it's us and Papua New Guinea and Uruguay or something like that. Even among private companies, there's more variability, but typically it's rare for particularly men to get paid paternal leave, as one example. But where I think you see more cultural similarity is the point you made, which is that, and this is consistent with the figure I showed earlier, higher status jobs, higher paying jobs usually afford you more workplace flexibility, not just in terms of hybrid work, but just in terms of day-to-day. I have a kid who's sick. I need to take off work and go home to pick up that kid. That's the kind of flexibility that's built into higher status, higher paying jobs that is just not there for lower status or lower paying jobs. I don't know if you had a question that was embedded within that about government versus non-government jobs. And I don't know that I could even speak to that as much anyway. Shall I peer into the crystal ball a bit?
Let's peer into the crystal ball and then we go back to some other questions. That sounds great, Joe. Thank you very
Okay.
much.
I mean, I should say, I'm a little hesitant to peer into the crystal ball just because I'm, for two reasons. One is I'm usually wrong when I try to predict things in general. I mean, I thought Hillary Clinton was going to be president for one. But secondly, just my review of the literature, one thing I tried to do as I was kind of putting this talk together was say, where are we at with the research on this? And I just don't think that there's a lot of consensus right now. And I'm specifically talking about kind of living in the post-pandemic world. I realize we're not in the post-pandemic world yet. We're still in a pandemic, but you might be sitting here thinking to yourself, is everything I've said irrelevant at this point? Because there's been such a seismic shift with the way we approach work. And it's possible that the pandemic is maybe starting to dislodge these kind of this stubborn cultural model I've been talking about that's been around since at least mid 20th century with the male breadwinner, female housewife kind of, I'm stereotyping, but that's kind of this stubborn model that's been around. First, I have to say, like I said, I'm hesitant to peer into the crystal ball, but I just don't think there's a lot of consensus. We're still forming a picture right now, and it's an incomplete picture, but I do think there's a couple things that are clear. One is that flex work, I think, is here to stay. Just as one example, people want flexible work schedules. This is a survey from last year. Only 2% of people wanted to go back to work full-time in person. This is specifically asking about remote work and hybrid work, but virtually everybody wants to have some hybrid or remote work possibilities. And as I said before, more companies than ever are starting to offer that as well. This is a study from this year. This is a study from 12 different countries asking about work flex policies. And I thought this was an interesting quote, so I'm just going to read the quote. It said that the authors of this paper document a change in the psychological contract between employees and managers, where work flex is being changed from an exclusive perk that managers can choose to give the few to a core privilege that all employees feel they are entitled to. So does that mean the work flexibility stigma is going away or will go away? I'm not gonna firmly come down on one side or the other. I'm gonna give a pessimistic take and I'm gonna give an optimistic take. So I'm gonna start with the pessimistic take. The same surveys that I've been showing recently that show that men and women desire workplace flexibility also show that there's some lingering gender differences here. So for instance, this survey from just a couple months ago showed that men lag behind women about 10% in terms of desiring remote work. And another survey from recently found that 20% of 20% of men, but only 13% of women say they think that working remotely during the pandemic has hurt their chances of promotion or advancement. So that's completely consistent with what I was saying 10 years ago with the flexible work stigma, and particularly the stigma targeting men. Another reason for pessimism, executives seem to be less on board with this flexible work revolution. So even though most non-executives desire not to go back to work full-time in the office, executives seem to be pushing more for going back to the office full-time. And it's not coincidental that most of those executives tend to be men. So to the extent that male leaders are driving policy, that would suggest that that's going to hamper work-life balance and flexibility efforts even into the future. Finally, another reason I think to be pessimistic is that there's some research in psychological literature, including some of my own, that suggests that when people perceive, and particularly men perceive, society is changing rapidly, that can be seen as an identity threat. That men perceive, particularly changes to gender roles and the way things are happening on the ground in terms of gender, as a threat to their sense of male role and male identity. And that can promote zero-sum thinking, that if women are making changes in the workplace, if women are entering the workforce and things are starting to change in the workplace, that men must be losing something if women are gaining something. That's what I mean by zero-sum thinking. And that can make it hard for men to fully embrace work-life balance and work flexibility. So the idea, in other words, is that change itself can be threatening to men. We did a study in 2018. This was led by a graduate student in our department, Sophie Kohinka, where we explicitly test these ideas. We had people, first of all, we had them read one of two news stories. One of them suggested that emphasized how women were making gains in the workplace and how gender inequalities, the other one emphasized how gender inequalities persist. So the first one was meant to kind of be a potential threat to the status quo, the gender hierarchy status quo. And so we asked them to read these, and then after that, we asked them about how much they supported work-life balance norms. So we asked them, how much do you support things like businesses should redesign the workplace to make it easier for employees to balance their work lives and their personal lives, or any employee should be allowed to take advantage of flexible family arrangements as long as the work gets done. So things like that. What we found was that after men read statements that suggested, or a paragraph that suggested changes happening with respect to gender, that led them to be less supportive of work-life balance. And that was mediated by zero-sum thinking. That is, that system threat to the status quo increased their zero-sum thinking, which then increased their decreased their work-life balance endorsement. We did not find that for women. That was only for men. So the idea again is that to the extent that the pandemic has quickly upended these kind of traditional norms about the way things have always been done, that actually might be threatening rather than welcoming, for at least for men, because that might, trigger these kind of zero-sum beliefs that might lead them to resist flexible work arrangements. So that's the pessimistic take. Let me give you the optimistic take as well. So I think there's also reason to be a little more optimistic as well. First of all, work flex can be good for people. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that people not only like work flex, but that it actually makes them feel better, makes them less stressed out, makes them less anxious when they have flexible flex time, flex place. And that's important because to overcome this flexibility stigma, we need to, and I mentioned this earlier, and we talked about this earlier, we need to convince organizations of the business case for flexibility. And the pandemic may have done just that. So it might have taken a pandemic to provide us this evidence to organizations that that flexible working, which, as I said, was previously stigmatized, because it's made people feel like that they were unproductive, that they were less dedicated. This is the point that I think was it Ben who was making the point that it actually can result in exactly the opposite, that just showing businesses, I think what maybe the pandemic is showing is that there's benefits to that. It might not only be helping people, but it might be helping businesses themselves recognize that you get less turnover, you get more dedicated workforce and so forth, and more productive workforce. So there might be an efficiency argument to be made. But I think even above and beyond the case that you make to businesses, the other thing that I think is happening here is that it's making the case, it's showing men themselves that there's benefits to themselves and to their identity. So during the pandemic, men are being pushed into more caregiving roles and unpaid care work than they were before. So there's now a number of time diary studies that are showing that it's not just men, it's both mothers and fathers in particular are spending more time caregiving, but it's a disproportionate increase among fathers. And so there's some interesting research coming out by people like Brigitte Schulte, who's showing that just that experience of providing care actually changes men in, I think, pretty fundamental ways. It makes them more likely to identify as caregivers. It makes them more willing to push back against this ideal worker status quo at work in order to give care. And there's even some interesting neurological evidence from the past decade or so showing that the brains of people, the fundamental neural circuitry can be changed by truly investing in caregiving. And that's true for not only mothers, but for fathers as well. So that's the more optimistic take. So it's possible, although I'd like to see more data on this, perhaps other people know of some data that it took a pandemic, but maybe these stubborn norms, these masculine norms about work devotion and the ideal worker might be starting to shift. We might be seeing a change in what it means to be a man, and that might be kind of expanding for this idea that it involved caregiving as part of what it means to be a man, and more equal divisions of household labor, including emotional labor, which I think I should mention as well. Again, this is pretty speculative though, and also I think this applies more to mostly to heterosexual couples with children more than it might apply to other people. So I thought I would end with just maybe I'll just end with some more some speculative solutions, and then I can open this up for further questions and more general comments and questions. So I wanted in kind of with not just presenting the problems. It's easier to present problems and barriers, but I thought maybe I could say a little bit about what I think maybe some solutions might be. And here there have been some, and I also wanted to mention this because in some of the recent writings that I've read, some people have said, the pandemic hasn't been good for gender equality. It's actually been a trap, particularly for women, because it's increasing the expectations for home care in a way that it hasn't for men. And I'm not going to argue against that. I'm not going to say that's not true. But what I am trying to argue in this talk is that it doesn't have to be this way. That if men and women participate equally in flexible work, if men and women participate more equally in domestic care, that's what it's going to take to overcome the flexibility stigma against men. But how do we do that? So what are some solutions, or what are some suggestions? I'm going to suggest some solutions at the organizational level, at the more maybe societal level, and at the relational level. So at the organizational level, first, I think there needs to be a cultural shift. I think we need to decrease normative pressures to be singularly devoted to work. And if you want equality, Hannah and I talked about this earlier before the talk about how we need equal representation, not just in the workplace. And I think there's been a lot of focus on that in scholarship and in the real world as well. We've seen that, women have made a lot of strides in terms of more diversity in terms of occupational roles, leadership roles. What we've seen less and what we've made less progress with is in getting men into more traditional feminine roles and communal roles and in caregiving. I think that's where we need to kind of put more effort. Organizational climates are an important factor in restricting or enabling men's communal engagement. So one solution would be to get rid of toxic masculinity cultures. So how do you do that? I don't have a magic bullet for that, but I would argue that it's one thing I think it's something that leaders of organizations need to be aware of, whether they have these kind of masculinity contest cultures, because we know that those are associated with poor individual outcomes for men, for women, but also for organizations as well. And this leads into the point I was making about making the business case for work-family balance. I'm not going to belabor it because I mentioned it already, but just that organizations can stand to improve by allowing workplace flexibility. And then I think it was Ben who made the point or asked the question about whether one avenue for that might be through modeling at the top of behavior. And a couple of famous examples are Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, who took a 2-month paternity leave, and more recently Pete Buttigieg, who took a paternity leave while he was the Secretary of Transportation. I think these are enormously important symbolic acts for men to step up and say, look, it's really important for not only women to do this, but for men to do this as well. So that's one suggestion I would have. At the societal level, what can we do there? I think governments can effectively regulate for more equality. All we have to do is look to our friends over in the Nordic countries to see a model for how this could take place, for how well that can work. When they created, for places like Sweden, Finland, Iceland, when they created more equal division of parental leave policies by shifting the default to taking it for men, that actually had a big effect incentivizing men to take them. It paid off in terms of men actually doing more equal division of parental responsibilities in the home. Am I optimistic that Nordic model, that we can achieve that in the United States? Not really, but at least we have a model for how it could look and how it's paid off. I also think that we can encourage pro-social behavior in men. I think about my research, my colleague's research, Alyssa Croft at Arizona, who's done some focus on pro-social behavior in men. She's written about how pro-sociality provides, I think, a unique entry point for a couple of reasons. One is it's immediately rewarding to train men to be more pro-social. And we know that cultivates positive attitudes. Secondly, it's less threatening because it doesn't challenge the gender status hierarchy for men to behave pro-socially. And so it's, less susceptible to backlash. And it's also a skill that can be learned, which, increases efficacy. So examples of how you can encourage prosociality. One example is UNICEF's campaign for super dads, which portrayed celebrity dads as being active in childcare activities, people like David Beckham and other athletes, and also called for fathers around the world to share their own pictures of them taking care of their children. So that's just one example of how this could look. Another example would be more informal social support networks, things like Facebook groups, Becoming Dad or How to Dad, or social networks like the Dad's Network are ways to kind of create these informal social networks to encourage prosociality among men. And then at the relational level, I think partners have to work together to determine a division of work and a division of family and division of family roles that benefits them both. But here, I think actually women may inadvertently restrict men's communal engagement through what's known as maternal gatekeeping, which I'm sure some people are familiar with. This is when mothers show a lack of encouragement or even a discouragement of their partner's engagement in domestic responsibilities, particularly for children and children's upbringing. So I think that there needs to be an awareness of that and kind of stepping back in some sense. I mentioned emotional labor. There's a lot of surveys where you ask men, how much do you think you're contributing to domestic care? And men will often overestimate how much they're doing. And I think that's partly because they forget about emotional labor, which can be really exhausting. So things like the decision making of who in children's upbringing, and that largely falls on women, like which daycare should we put the child in, or which hobbies are the children going to pursue, or who's going to remember to cut the kids' toenails, or pack their lunches, or these kinds of things, go to the parent-teacher conferences. Those are the things that traditionally fall on women that men don't really think about when they think of how much they're dividing the domestic labor. So there's a lot of surveys that have come out since the pandemic that says, how much are you doing at home? Men will say, oh, it's pretty much 50-50. And women will say, nah, it's more like 80-20. And I think they're forgetting the emotional labor component of that. So I think there needs to be a recognition of that. And then lastly, I would say communication between young people, young men and women, about their aspirations and their expectations for future role divisions. And that can be, I think, structurally embedded in discussions at school, even early on. We know that young women are increasingly opposing these kind of traditional role divisions, and they want partners who are communal and family oriented. And that's particularly true of women who have high career aspirations themselves. And so I think those kind of discussions are important, because we know that when you tell men, heterosexual men, that this is what women are looking for, that they will actually change their expectations and they'll actually increase their empathic skills to kind of match what they think women want. So I think that's another avenue for increasing men's engagement in communal roles as well. Okay, last slide. So this is, I wanted to end on an optimistic note here. So, I was asking myself, do I think that flexibility stigma is here to stay, or is it eroding? And I actually do think that the stigma is showing signs of eroding. And I actually think that change can happen more quickly than we might imagine. I'm going to use a metaphor here from plucking it from my home state of Florida. You may be familiar with sinkholes. So down in Florida's built on this kind of Swiss cheese of limestone underneath us, and you hear about these things every couple of months, of these enormous sinkholes opening up and swallowing everything. So people, tend to think that things are completely stable, but underneath there's all this stuff swirling around that kind of hides the stability on top, and people get surprised when these things open up. And I think this is in some ways a nice metaphor for norms, and norms can act that way as well, where what looks like stability on the surface often hides a lot of change and a lot of movement underneath that. And because of that, culture change can happen really quickly, or at least can appear to be surprising to people. And I think that's particularly true for gender norms. And so I think we tend to think that gender norms can be really stubborn, particularly masculine norms. But I would argue that masculinity is, we may be at this point now, and I think what the pandemic is doing is exposing some of this thing swirling underneath the surface, that masculinity is really performative. And if there's anything that I've, from a couple of decades of researching masculinity and manhood, it's taught me is that masculinity is really, and manhood is really performative, and what men privately value and embrace may not be exactly what they express publicly. And because of that, you can get these really stubborn norms, because men will think, well, I want change. I'm not really into this, but I think everybody else around me supports these changes or supports stability. And so you get these norms that kind of hold on long past the point which the majority of men don't really support them. And I think we may be at that point now where we're starting to see fissures, starting to see the pandemic has shown us another way, perhaps, and expose these fissures. Every time a person sees a father leaving work to pick up his sick kid from school, or every time we see a man opt out from this kind of complete devotion to work norms and says, I'm going to do a compressed work week, I think that changes things a little bit. And so, I would end by just saying, don't be surprised if these changes happen really quickly. So I'm going to stop there and open it up for discussion, for critiques, for holes in my logic, or anything else.
Joe, thank you. I regret we're at the end of our hour. We're so appreciative for this wonderful talk. And I did put you in it was a little bit of an unfair bind to ask you to pull up old work and bring it, bring it not only up to date, but through the pandemic into a really changing world. But we're so grateful for an incredibly stimulating talk, and it's such an important stage setting conversation in this series, just highlighting the importance of considering men's role in the home as well as women's advancement in paid labor, for thinking about questions of gender equality, and thinking also more broadly about the role of gender, not only in relation to women and pay, but in terms of men and breaking into what are femininely stereotypic roles. And your theory development within psychology in relation to masculinity, as we saw in the last talk, is influencing the future of research around these questions in the negotiation field. So really, truly, we're very, very grateful for your being with us today, but also for all of the work that you've done that led you to here. So please, group, join me in thanking Joe for this stimulating talk.